In our previous lecture, we have already discussed regarding the international refugee problems and how it was originated in Europe in the year 1685 by withdrawal or revocation of the Edict of Nantes by the French authorities, which led to the flight of Protestants from France to other neighboring European countries, and how the Russian refugee problem, and also we have discussed regarding the Latin American refugee crisis. So in this particular lecture, we would like to devote our precious time in regards to the African refugee crisis, and so also the Asian refugee crisis and the role executed by United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, and the role as it was defined under the 1951 Convention on determining the status of refugees. So let us we go to the African refugee crisis. The first of these problems in African continent concerns some 130,000 Algerian refugees in Morocco and Tunisia, including a large number of women and children. A special relief program was launched for them in 1958 in cooperation with other United Nations agencies and non-governmental organizations in pursuant to specific resolutions of the General Assembly. Following the Evian Agreement of 1962 between the Provisional Algerian government and the French authorities, as Algeria was a colony of the French. Particularly, all of these refugees returned to Algeria with the assistance of United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee. So, in 1961, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee was confronted with new refugee problems in several parts of African continent, which may be divided into two distinct categories. There were on the one hand a number of refugee emergencies mainly resulting from internal strife in several countries, which has already gained independence. On the other hand, there was an increasing flow of refugees from territories under Portuguese administration and also from South Africa, Namibia, and southern Rhodesia, which is at presently known as Zimbabwe, to neighboring countries. Major movements falling within the former category included the exodus from Rwanda, mainly persons belonging to the Batusti tribe, which began in 1961 as a result of the deep-seated political and social tension in that country. They sought asylum in Burundi, yeah, which at the time was called Congo, Uganda, and the United Republic of Tanzania, where their number soon reached 1,35,000. Also in the early 1960s, political conflict within the newly independent states such as Zaire resulted in a movement of refugees to Burundi, Central African Republic, Sudan, Uganda, and the United Republic of Tanzania. By 1966, their numbers had reached more than 80,000. As from 1967, an influx of Ethiopian refugees, mainly of Eritrean origin, took place into Sudan, where this group has grown over to 90,000 refugees. And in the 1970s, the Sudan had offered refuge to other groups of Ethiopian refugees seeking asylum. Another movement that occurred in the 70s, also caused by internal strife, had been that of refugees from Burundi, belonging mostly to the Hutu tribe, and in between 1973 and at the end of 1975, some 1,35,000 of these refugees had crossed the borders of Zaire, Rwanda, and the United Republic of Tanzania. And by 1972, the exodus from the Sudan into neighboring Uganda, Zaire, and the Central African Republic had involved almost 1,60,000 to 1,80,000 persons as refugees, from many of whom were assisted by United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees to settle on the land while awaiting a peaceful solution which would permit their return. The solution came with the signature in 1977 among the parties affected on the issues of refugee crisis. The South Sudan operation set several important precedents. As in the case of Algeria, it involved assistance within the country to which refugees returned. But this time, however, on a much larger scale. As from the early 1960s, there was growing international concern for the process of decolonization. So, United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees for its part was first confronted with the increasing problem of Angolans seeking refuge in Zaire, with a refugee population which was to exceed 500,000. By the mid of 1970s, it became in size the largest single refugee problem in Africa, widely scattered mainly over the adjacent border areas. The Angolans were well received by the local population. The majority were able to engage in agriculture while receiving a certain amount of assistance from the Jarian authorities, voluntary agencies, and United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, which provided mainly medical and educational facilities. The much smaller number of Angolans who had sought refuge in Zambia were for the most part accommodated in organized rural settlements supported by United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. So by 1965, hostilities in Mozambique had provoked an influx of Mozambicans into Tanzania, and where they numbered around 80,000 in 1974. So, exactly in regards to the African crisis, we found these are the developments which were resulted in the African refugee crisis in 1960s, 17s, and 80s. And now we would like to go to the Asian refugee crisis. So until 1970, the problems of refugee with which United Nations High Commission of Refugee had to deal in Asia and the Far East had been limited in size and scope, and were by then on their way to being solved. In 1971, however, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees was confronted with a problem of unprecedented size, and that was the influx of East Bengalis into the neighboring regions of India following the internal conflicts in East Pakistan. The total number of arrivals over a period of less than a year was estimated by the then Indian government to be of the order of 10 million refugees. The majority had to be housed in camps in West Bengal, one of the provincial state of the Union of India at present. Following the New Delhi Agreement of August 1972, the United Nations High Commissioner was entrusted by the Secretary General with the task of arranging the return to their respective homelands of some 240,000 Pakistanis and East Bengalis through governmental contributions and with the ready operational assistance of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The United Nations High Commissioner Refugees was unable to complete this task by July 1974, mainly through the organization of a massive airlift between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Since 1974, developments in Indo-Chine Peninsula have involved United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in several further special operations in keeping with the above resolution following the Paris Agreement of January 1973. An initial program with a target of $12 million was launched for the period of 1974 and 75. So, exactly a separate program of some $12 million was launched in Thailand to assist the close cooperation with the Thai authorities. The large number of displaced persons, estimated about 70,000 in December 1975, who arrived in that country mainly from Laos, but also from Cambodia and South Vietnam. So, in that context, we'd like to discuss the very role executed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and also the role played by the very convention that was adopted in 1951. So, in that connection, we would like to discuss the very role played by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, and it started its role exactly in the European refugee crisis, also in the crisis that originated in Latin America. So, in that connection, I would like to discuss the very role played by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. So, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees exactly framed its role as per the Constitution or the statutes of United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. So, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, in the case of Europe, it played its important role in the year 1974 in August in regards to the problems of displaced persons in Cyprus. And in that connection, it provided humanitarian assistance in Cyprus and undertook a large-scale program of relief and assistance for the benefit of over 2 lakh persons displaced and seriously affected. And in that connection also we could discuss the very role played by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in Latin America. So in case of Latin America, the outstanding problems of refugees around 1 lakh during the year of 1970s and 80s in relation to Chile, Bolivia, Brazil and Uruguay, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, which played an important role. So also, in that connection, we would like to discuss the very role played by United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in 1970s and 80s in regards to the refugees in Chilean refugees emerging from emergency relief in Argentina and Peru, so also in other Latin American countries. So also the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees played an important role. And in African context also. But in particularly the resolution 1672 or 1672, the Assembly's request the High Commissioner to envisage the possibility of facilitating the re-establishment of these refugees. So, in 1961, in connection to Africa, the United Nations High Commissioner Refugee, in connection to the refugees of South Africa, Namibia, and Southern Rhodesia, or those refugees exodus from Rwanda, and in 1961. So also in regards to Burundi, Zaire, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, also in case of the United Republic of Tanzania or South Sudan operation, set several important precedents. And in that connection, we would like to discuss the role played by United Nations High Commissioner and in particularly as logical consequences of high priority traditionally given to voluntary repatriation and as the most desirable and satisfactory solution. The United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees Assistance in facilitating rehabilitation process was indeed all the more appropriate in view of the major economic and social problems which accompanied the widespread devastation caused by the long years of civil strife in Africa, especially in the area to which people were returning. It was also the vast occasion on which United Nations High Commission refugees were asked to assist persons displaced within their own country. So, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, for its part, was first confronted with increasing problem of Angolans seeking refuge in jail. The majority were able to engage in agriculture while receiving a certain amount of assistance from the Zairian authorities, voluntary agencies, and United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which provided mainly medical and educational facilities. The much smaller number of Angolans who had sought refuge in Zambia were for the most part accommodated in organized rural settlements supported by the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. So, a considerable United Nations High Commission refugee assistance program was put into effect within a view to their settlement in rural areas with cooperation of the local authorities and of voluntary agencies, especially in Tanzania. It was necessary to establish new rural settlements with all that this entailed in terms of basic infrastructure, including in particular the clearance of woods, the building of access roads, and provisions of basic medical and educational facilities and of the necessary equipment to enable the refugees to settle and thereby become self supporting and independent of international assistance. So the United Nations High Commission Refugees was called upon to establish special programs to facilitate the repatriation of the refugees from Mozambique and Angola in keeping with the recommendations adopted by the Executive Committee of the High Commissioner's Program at its 25th session. So now we would like to discuss the role played by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in context to Asia. So the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees was confronted with the problem of unprecedented size influx of East Bengalis into the neighboring regions of India following the internal conflicts in East Pakistan. So, after the agreement of 1973, which was known as the New Delhi Agreement, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees was entrusted by the Secretary General with the task of arranging the return to their respective homelands of some 240,000 Pakistanis and East Bengalis. So, in that connection, the operational assistance was provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the United Nations High Commission on Refugees was enabled to complete this task by July 1974, mainly through the organization of a massive airlift between Pakistan and Bangladesh. And since 1974, developments in the Indo-Chine Peninsula have involved United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in several further special operations in keeping with the above resolution. So, following the Paris Agreement of 1973, an initial program with a target of $12 million was launched for the period 1974 and 75 with the concurrence of the Secretary General in order to assist in rehabilitating hundreds of thousands of displaced and uprooted persons mainly in rural areas in Laos and Vietnam. Part of this program could not be implemented due to the development in South Vietnam during 1975. So during the actual hostilities in March and April 1975, the United Nations High Commission Refugee also participated in an emergency operation of considerable magnitude jointly with United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund in the area, mainly to provide relief for the uprooted populations. So contribution in cash and kind amounting to over $15 million were channeled through United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. A separate program of some $12 million was also launched in Thailand by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to assist in close cooperation with the Thai authorities. The large number of displaced persons, estimated over 70,000 in December 1975, who arrived in that country mainly from Laos but also from Cambodia and South Vietnam. So, now we would like to discuss the very role played by the 1951 Convention. So, the very Convention of 1951, how it exactly contributed to the very growth and in regards to controlling the refugee crisis. So the convention relating to status of refugees, which grants refugees basic rights and freedoms and lays down minimum standards for their treatment. This convention applies in a great many countries and even in those countries which have not subscribed formally to the convention. As in case of India, we could cite that it had not subscribed formally to the convention. So it serves as a guide and an example. It is interesting to examine the reasons for this development. So, we would like to discuss that the appropriate international organs were created to provide refugees with protection. So, we would like to describe these various international instruments and the nature of this international protection. For at the moment, legal position of the refugees, and in that regard the very definition of an alien, his legal position, however, differs from that of the ordinary aliens in certain fundamental respect. So, in order to enable the refugees to overcome the difficulties resulting from his special position, to facilitate his integration also for humanitarian reasons, it is necessary to grant him certain basic rights. These rights are more favorable than those enjoyed by the ordinary alien and, in various respects, assimilate his legal position to that of a national. These special rights enjoyed by refugees, in accordance with international agreements, form part of what is known as refugee status, legal status, which has came to be internationally recognized under the 1951 Convention. So now we would like to conclude our lecture on refugees and refugee law. The first international instrument relating to refugees were for the benefit of refugees from Russia. Thereafter, further the instruments were adopted for the benefit of Russian, Armenian, Assyrian, and Turkish refugees, and after Hitler's rise to power, refugees from Germany and from Austria. The earlier instruments dealt with the issues of certificates of identity for the use as travel documents, as it was known as Nansen passports, while the latter instruments contain more comprehensive provisions dealing, for example, with protection against deportation, the right to work, and the law governing a refugee's personal status. So, the basic international instrument relating to refugees, which consolidated earlier instruments, the Refugee Convention of 1951. The convention embodies various fundamental principles and goes further than earlier instrument in defining the specific rights and freedoms of refugees. So also, the convention provides that it would be applied without discrimination as to race, religion, or country of origin, and exemption of the refugees from reciprocity and condition for the enjoyment of certain rights and benefits by aliens, and as the very law of the country of his residence, the specific rights and freedoms to be granted to refugees include freedom to practice religion and freedom as regards to religious education of the refugees' children, free access to courts, the right subject to certain conditions to engage in wage earning, employment, and the exercise of liberal professions, and rights as regards elementary education, public relief and assistance, labor legislation, and social security. So the 1951 Convention for the first time contains a definition which, despite certain limitations, is capable of universal application. The term refugee is defined as any person who has been considered a refugee under the earlier international instruments and documents and the constitution of the International Refugee Organization, and in addition to any person who, as a result of events occurring before 1st January 1951, is outside his former home country because of well-founded fear of being prosecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social or political group, and having separate political opinion. So, in the very draft convention relating to status of refugees in Africa, it was adopted in the 1970s by the ad hoc committee of legal experts of Organization of African Union is substantially similar to the draft declaration, and similar provisions has been included in the principles concerning the treatment of refugees adopted by the Asian African Legal Consultative Committees at its Bangkok session in August 1975. So, this deadline had the effect of limiting the scope of the convention. Moreover, states on becoming parties to the convention are given the option of limiting their obligations. There are under two persons who have become refugees as a result of events in Europe. Our 16 states have taken advantage of this option, while the remaining 34 states, parties to the convention in the year 1977, including Denmark, have accepted the obligation of the convention without any geographic limitation. So, finally, we would like to conclude this lecture, under which almost we have discussed about the refugee crisis in African continent, also in Asian continent, and the role as executed by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, and also the role played by the determined under the 1951 Convention on determining the status of refugees. So the very conclusion that we took a length of time, finally we would like to conclude the First League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was Dr. Fridtjof Nansen. After World War II, the International Refugee Organization was established by the General Assembly in 1946. The International Refugee Organization granted legal and political protection to refugees falling within its competence. The organization's main function was, however, to seek a solution for the residual refugee problem of persons displaced from their homes through the events of the Second World War, which carried its activities from 1947 to 1951. So, here why we would like to conclude our discussion on this lecture on international refugee crisis and the refugee law that developed since the first quarter of 20th century up to the adoption of the 1951 Convention determining status of refugee and establishment of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees by the United Nations Organization through resolutions by General Assembly. So, in this particular lecture, although we have discussed the very origin and development and the role of United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees and the laws relating to the 1951 Convention on determining the status of refugees. But we have left the present humanitarian crisis, which was started since 2011 and 12, and also the present humanitarian crisis that is continuing in Palestine and the ongoing war in between Ukraine and Russia. And that we would like to discuss in our upcoming lectures.